And they're saying, wind power, forget about it. That doesn't make any sense.
Who are the five majors?
It's the biggest is ExxonMobil, and then next is Royal Dutch Shell, a British Dutch company, and then BP, which is a British company, and then Chevron, U.S.-based company, and finally Total, a French company with some Italian participation.
The reason I asked, Jim, is because I wanted you to make that point that three of those five are foreign countries. And in fact, when I look at the oil majors, I don't see them as American companies. I see them as transnational companies that have no particular allegiance to the United States or its agenda.
Well, I mean, that's true of any of these big companies. I mean, Exxon actually, for a very long period of time, has been deriving the majority of its revenues from outside the United States. But that doesn't mean that they're not hugely influential over the United States government and influential over other governments too. If we take the case of the United Kingdom, there was some report not long ago that Tony Blair had a weekly meeting, I think it was weekly, with the leaders of the 10 largest companies in the UK. Now, Tony Blair is not meeting weekly with anybody else, but these guys he was. And those, of course, those two of those 10 were, and the two most strongest voices, because the companies were by far the biggest in the UK, were Shell and BP. So, I mean, you can argue as much as you want that these companies are all over the world and that they have interests all over the world and so on. And they certainly influence other governments. But when it comes to their home governments, their influence is incalculable.
Do you care to follow up on Seymour Hersh's article at all about our covert operations? I mean, we know that these five oil majors have pretty much hired, if you will. I'm going to sound very cynical, but it's the way it is. Pretty much hired the U.S. military as its security force in the region. Working to enforce its agenda. Right. That's the overt. Talk about the covert a little bit.
Well, Cy Hirsch has been writing a lot about the U.S. policy in Iran, and there's, I think, very little doubt that the U.S. government and the oil companies would like to get a hold of Iranian oil, too. And so, of course, there's been saber-rattling that everyone knows about, and threats that there would be airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities and all this kind of thing. But what Cy Hirsch was writing about recently in the New Yorker was covert operations inside of Iran to, let's say, fund and arm different groups there that might act against, local targets and create problems of all kinds. And, of course, if this isn't promoting terrorism, I would like to know what is. This is clearly exactly that.
That's exactly what we talked about with our last guest, Reese Ehrlich. And in fact, we called it U.S.-sponsored terrorism in Iran.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's perfectly obvious that they've been doing this as a matter of policy around the world continuously. And if you consider the Contra episode in Central America aimed at Nicaragua, those were certainly terrorists too, and there was a very big operation there during the Reagan years. But you could mention many other cases too, and where dissident forces of one kind or another. Sometimes, it's not to say that these dissidents don't have some grievance, but you go from a local grievance to an armed group that's beginning to sabotage infrastructure and attack government forces and everything, and then the government strikes back, and then the whole thing escalates, and that's exactly what the CIA and the military special ops people want.
Aren't our prisons full of gangs that do this every day?
Well, it's it's very sad, and the world is a very, very much more dangerous and bloody place as a result of these things. The United States, it's fair to say, is not the only country in the world that's doing this kind of a thing. Other countries with big intelligence apparatuses do the same, and but it's a lot. The United States is the biggest player in this game. They have the most money and they're the most assets, and they're doing it big time. The Brits do it, the French do it, the Russians do it, the Chinese do it, and so on. And we have all these actors out there, all stirring the pot in different ways, and in Africa in particular, but everywhere. You're talking about an awful lot of violence and an awful lot of people that are being harmed by it.
Jim, the congressman who represents our district, where this our station in KZYX is located, is Mike Thompson, who's a senior Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. If he were listening right now, and I hope he is, and I suspect he is, what would you tell him? What advice would you give him? What advice would you give the next president?
Well, in terms of Iraq in particular, the advice is get out of there. There's this thing is costing the United States extremely dearly, and it's costing the Iraqis, of course, much more, and it's creating an awful lot of violence and instability in the region. And the United States' long-term interests are not, the oil companies may be hoping to get their hands on that oil, but the United States will be much better served if it focuses its attention on new forms of energy and new forms of transportation, and instead of trying to monopolize the last drops of this stuff wherever they can be found. As for intelligence in general, most of what passes for intelligence is pretty unintelligent, and all these super developed, huge budgets for these, and it's not about gathering information. It's just about doing what we were saying, which is causing trouble and torturing people. The CIA has been up to its ears in torture, and there's a very important new book out about this. But anyway, it's all well known.
What is the book? What is the book, Jim?
I can't remember. I just was reading about it in the paper. Just I think it was yesterday. They were reporting this. But it's about it's about the use of torture. And what the book, the headline was that the book was revealing that the International Committee of the Red Cross had presented an analysis to the U.S. government about torture by the CIA in different places. And this is the International Committee of the Red Cross is the most